Namaskar, and welcome to the Indology podcast, where we journey through the pages of history, politics, and dharma. In each episode, I read to you excerpts from important books, offering insights into the Bharatiya civilization in a quest to discover why we are what we currently are. In this episode, I'm going to read you an excerpt from this book called Darbar, which was written by Tavleen Singh, who many of you might know as a rather left-leaning journalist, a member of the Lutyens elite, one of the people who are often referred to as the Khan Market Gang. So why am I reading an excerpt from a book written by a journalist who is obviously biased? The reason for that is that this person also had access to the people in power, to the upper rungs of power in the Indian system, which is of course always centered around the Gandhis, before 2014 that is. And in the excerpt that I am going to read you today, it focuses on the violence that was unleashed by the Congress goons, the Congress workers on the 6th after the assassination of Indira Gandhi. This is an account from a Lutyens Delhi insider on what exactly happens when a prime minister is assassinated. So while she may be biased, it still gives us a rather clear picture into what happened in the days following the assassination of Mrs. Gandhi. In Darbar, Tavleen Singh writes, "This is what happened on 31st of October, 1984, the day after Diwali that year. As usual, everyone had eaten and drunk too much on Diwali. The windows of my bedroom were open, and I remember the air still smelled of firecrackers. I was dozing rather than asleep that morning when the telephone rang. It must have been ringing for a while because when I picked it up, my bureau chief sounded annoyed. 'Mrs. Gandhi has been shot,' Cable Sahab said. 'They've taken her to the medical institute. Get there as soon as you can, before they close the gates.' 'What? When?' 'About 15 minutes ago. We are not sure if she's dead and we are not sure who it was. Go immediately.' 'I can't believe it. God, I hope it wasn't 6. So do I.' My first reaction was to open the window of my room wider and stare into the public park outside to see if the news had spread. It was luminous, sunny early winter morning. Ayahs with their small charges gossiped on the benches. Toddlers stumbled around in bright sweaters and office-goers went by on bicycles and scooters. Nobody seemed to have heard yet. I threw on some clothes, raced downstairs and hopped into an auto rickshaw. It would have taken less than 10 minutes for me to get to the All India Institute of Medical Sciences, but by the time I got there, its black, wrought iron gates were locked from the inside. A single-armed policeman stood guard, and I joined the small group of reporters gathered outside the closed gates. The enormity of what had happened sunk in, and we stared at each other without speaking. More reporters came, and like us, they stared silently at the closed gates. When 2 foreign TV crews appeared, they attracted enough attention for passerbys to stop and ask questions. Television crews were a rare sight in those days. Someone said, 'The Prime Minister's been shot.' The news spread fast, and before long, a large crowd gathered behind us. They were mostly middle-class office-goers in badly stitched pants and in terraline shirts. They parked their scooters by the hospital wall and stood with grim expressions on their faces. They murmured about consequences and seemed more certain than us that Mrs. Gandhi was dead. Every reporter there that morning had heard something of what had happened. Then, just as I was about to try and find another way into the hospital, I noticed an intelligence man I knew quietly coming up and joining the crowd. 'Is she dead?' I asked him softly. 'Yes,' he whispered back, 'but please don't say anything yet. They want to keep it quiet till the evening when Rajiv comes back from his tour.' 'Why?' 'The president isn't here and he will be needed to swear Rajiv in as Prime Minister.' 'Prime Minister?' 'Yes.' Others noticed us talking, and he disappeared into the crowd that was now muttering and getting restive. "What did he say?" someone asked me. "She's dead." The words were barely out of my mouth when the hospital's gates opened and a cavalcade of white ambassadors drove out at high speed. In one of them, I saw Sonia, weeping. The gates closed immediately, but by now the crowd was sure that Mrs. Gandhi was dead and that she had been killed by Sikhs. The reaction was not grief, but rage. The air filled with talks of revenge, but none of us knew what this meant. Not even Keval Sahab, who was always so prescient about these things. When I called to give him the news that Mrs. Gandhi was dead, he said there would be trouble, and he was worried about what could happen to ordinary Sikhs. But the way he said it, I sensed that he expected just a bit of violence. On that day of pale gold sunlight, with a hint of winter in the air and the sound of children playing in a garden near the medical institute, I was among those who would have said, if asked, that there may be just a bit of violence. I would never have predicted that what we would see in Delhi in the next few days would be the worst violence since the partition riots, and that more than 3,000 Sikhs would be killed in the carnage. From the medical institute, I went to Mrs. Gandhi's house on Safdarjung Road. Naveen lived at the time in Safdarjung Lane, directly behind Mrs. Gandhi's house, and I called him to ask if he had heard or seen anything. "Not a thing," he said, but the servants heard some shots and thought they were Diwali crackers. In the street outside the house, the neem trees were shedding their plump yellow pods. Uneven sticky patches of yellow stained the pavements and the bitter smell of neem filled the air. When I arrived, the street was empty. But other reporters soon arrived, and from sources inside the house, we continued to try and piece together the story. This is what we knew by that evening. Mrs. Gandhi had stepped out of her house at about 9 a.m. and was walking through her garden towards her office in a bungalow that adjoined her house, when her Sikh bodyguard, Beyant Singh, greeted her with his hands joined together. Then he shot her with his pistol. Another bodyguard, Satwant Singh, opened fire with his automatic weapon. She had barely fallen to the ground when Sonia, the only member of the family at home that morning, rushed out. Sonia told me many days later, when I finally got a chance to talk to her, that she had heard the shots and come out to scold the gardener's children for continuing to play with firecrackers when Diwali was over. That evening, all we knew was that when she saw what had happened, she looked for the ambulance that is always parked in the Prime Minister's house and found that the driver had gone for a cup of tea. So Sonia put her mother-in-law into a white ambassador and took her to the medical institute. I continued to wait with other reporters in the street outside the house for hours in the hope of gathering more details of the assassination, and in the hope that we might be able to talk to Rajiv if he came home before being sworn in as Prime Minister. It got colder and darker, and the smell of squashed neem pods mixed with cigarette smoke and the scent of hot tea. An enterprising chaiwala had set up a shop on the pavement and offered us ready-made tea in plastic cups and roasted chickpeas. Had there really been a third assassin who had disappeared? Why had Beyant Singh and Satwant Singh been shot by the Prime Minister's security men immediately after they were arrested, as they were the only people who could have given information about a wider conspiracy if there was one? Should they not have been kept alive? We got no answers. All we learnt was that Satwant Singh was seriously wounded but still alive, and Beyant Singh was dead. Rajiv arrived late that evening and drove straight to Rashtrapati Bhavan, where he was sworn in as Prime Minister of India in a ceremony that was hurried and private. I was in my sister's house on Jantar Mantar Road when he made his first speech as Prime Minister. We watched him on television. In a calm, emotionless voice, he said India had lost a great leader, someone who was not just his mother, but the mother of the country, or words to that effect. Then he stopped and stared sadly at the camera while Doordarshan showed shots of HKL Bhagat and his supporters beating their breasts and shouting, "Khoon ka badla khoon se lenge." Blood will be avenged with blood. He should have said something about not resorting to violence, my brother-in-law said with a worried frown. As a Sikh and the owner of the Imperial Hotel on Janpath, he had reason to worry. Had Mrs. Gandhi been in his place, the first thing she would have said is, if one Sikh is killed, you will defile the memory of my mother or something like that. Why do you think he didn't say anything? Why are they showing shots of those people shouting, "Khoon ka badla khoon se lenge"? My sister said, angrily. Because he wants revenge, said my brother-in-law quietly. There are rumors that attacks on Sikhs have already started. A Sikh taxi driver in our hotel arrived this evening with his hair shorn off. He said he was surrounded by a mob in East Delhi and they tore off his turban and forcibly cut his hair. There will be a bit of anger, my sister said. That is only natural, but I'm sure it won't get out of hand because Rajiv is a decent man. He will definitely not allow innocent people to be killed. Right? I don't know, I said uncertainly. He is a good man, but he will now be surrounded by Mrs. Gandhi's advisors, and they are the sort of people who will tell him that he needs to show the Sikhs that they cannot get away with killing a prime minister. It worried me to see his party MPs among the people shouting those slogans on television just now. Why would they show that on Doordarshan unless they were trying to send a message? The day after Mrs. Gandhi's death was one of those especially beautiful days that you see in Delhi when summer ends and winter has not quite come. There was a light breeze that smelled of cold weather and dead leaves. The sky was the palest, most translucent blue, flecked with gold. The menace I had sensed in the air the day before was so absent that when the Sunday Times London asked if I would go to Amritsar and write a piece on the mood there and how Sikhs were reacting to the assassination, I readily agreed. Delhi seemed completely calm. By that evening, there were mobs trying to burn down my parents' house in Panchsheel Park, where they now lived, and wandering about other exclusive residential enclaves of South Delhi looking for Sikhs to kill. I took an early morning flight to Amritsar with the intention of returning late the same afternoon. Amritsar was so peaceful that I realized as soon as I got to the Golden Temple that nothing was going to happen here. Where there had been so much violence in the air 4 months ago, there was now a tired sort of peace. I sought out a local politician who had once been in the Congress party, but had resigned when the army attacked the Golden Temple. He lived in a tall, narrow house in a bazaar in the old city, so close to the temple that it was filled constantly with the sound of Sikh scriptures from the temple's loudspeakers. His terrace had a view of the white marble concourse and the sacred tank that was now filled with clean, clear water. On this terrace, we talked over a Punjabi breakfast of thick, milky tea and parathas lathered with butter. He admitted that Sikhs were not unhappy about Mrs. Gandhi being assassinated because they saw her death as retribution for desecrating the Golden Temple. He reminded me that anyone who had tried to desecrate this temple in the past had been punished. So, were her assassins heroes? I asked. He hesitated for a moment, then admitted this, but emphasized that the Sikhs he knew believed that justice had been done. I met other Sikhs who confirmed this. It was dusk when my plane landed in Delhi. I remember that it was a typical early winter dusk, with grit in the air and the scent of open fires. But there was something else as well, and it took me a few moments to realize that what was different was the smoky haze that seemed to have found its way even into the airport's arrivals lounge. Passengers sniffed the air nervously. It could be a short circuit, I heard somebody say. But when we came out, it became clear that the smoke came from real fires, big fires. Outside the terminal was the longest taxi queue I had ever seen. Taxis came and went at such infrequent intervals that when one came, I saw people begging each other to be allowed to share it. Some had given up and were standing on the highway, flagging down private cars. "Why are there no taxis?" I asked the pleasant-faced South Indian gentleman in the queue ahead of me. "They say it's because most of the taxi drivers are Sikhs and they are not leaving their homes because there is violence in the city. They're burning Sikh properties," is what my wife told me this morning when she called me in Bombay. After queuing for an hour, I realized it was pointless waiting any longer. I walked to the main road and started walking towards the city. After several cars sped by, an elderly gentleman in a black Fiat stopped and asked me where I wanted to go. Anywhere in the city. I am going to Rajouri Gardens, he said. You can drop me anywhere on the way, near Teen Murti House, wherever. Are you a Sikh? No, I lied. Even if you are, don't say you are if we get stopped. I was stopped 5 times on the way to the airport. I came to drop my daughter. Who stopped you? The mobs. They're all over the city. The smoke got thicker as we got closer to the city. The streets were empty. The old gentleman drove slowly, hunched forward over the wheel and looked out of the window to see through the smoke. At the Ashoka Hotel, not far from the Prime Minister's residence, we were stopped by the first mob. They were young men and small boys. The youngest would have been no more than 10. They carried cans of kerosene in their hands and oily rags, and seemed to think they were playing a game. They swarmed all over the little black Fiat, thumping on the bonnet and banging at the windows. Any Sikhs here? Any Sikhs? Are there any Sikhs in here? Any Sikhs? My elderly companion smiled and pointed to his clean-shaven face, saying it should be clear that he was not a Sikh, and I was his daughter. Disappointed, they waved us on. A few minutes later, there was another mob, and then another and another. On the streets were the remains of smouldering cars. Many of them were taxis, with burned bodies slumped over the steering wheel. I better drop you home, my benefactor said. I don't think you'll find a taxi anywhere in the city. Where do you live? Golf links, thank you. So that evening when I got home and heard that the house of Amarjeet and Amrita, friends of my sister, had been burned down and that their little girl had barely escaped with her life because the nursery was set on fire while she was asleep in it, I was not so much shocked as overcome by a sense of unreality. It did not seem possible. The story must be an exaggeration, I told my sister when she called. She said she had tried calling Amrita all day and had not been able to get through. One of Amrita's servants later turned up at her house to tell her what happened. Then someone else called to say that a retired general had died of a heart attack when a mob burned down his house in Greater Kailash. Then there were my own stories. My parents had been unable to leave their house because mobs had come hunting for Sikhs from both sides of the street in which they lived. If they had not been saved by a Hindu friend who tore down the board on the gate with my father's name on it before the mobs arrived, who knows what may have happened. The next day, the violence got worse, and it was no longer safe for my sister to continue living in her house on Jantar Mantar Road. She took the children and moved to the house of a Hindu friend. On the way there, she had to disguise her 2 boys as Hindus by making them wear caps, and heard her older son tell his 6-year-old brother, "Don't take off your cap on the way or they'll cut off your head." They did not encounter any mobs, which was lucky for the mobs because my sister's instructions to her driver were to drive right through them instead of stopping. Everyone I knew who had friends in political circles called them and told them what was happening in the city. They told them about the police refusing to register cases and the local administration doing absolutely nothing to protect citizens. But the new Prime Minister did nothing. Not even when senior political leaders like Chandrasekhar and Gandhiji's grandson, Rajmohan Gandhi, went to the Home Minister personally to urge him to call out the army for help. What we suffered in more genteel parts of the city was nothing. It was from across the Yamuna, where resettlement colonies now formed an endless landscape of shanties, that the worst stories came. By the evening of the second day, it was clear that we were talking about thousands being killed in the colonies across the river. And so it was that I went with a group of reporters to East Delhi. We saw the first bodies as soon as we crossed the river. They looked at first like logs, piled one on top of the other and burning in a large circular fire that was still smouldering. Sunlight, glinting off a gold ring, made me look closer, and I noticed that what I had thought was a piece of wood was a human arm. After the first few houses, I decided that I had seen enough, and I went back and sat in the car. A policeman walked by, smoking a cigarette, seemingly unperturbed by the carnage. When I asked why the police was not clearing the bodies, he said, "We cannot. The morgues are full, and so we will have to cremate them here." Where have the survivors been taken? Women and children have been taken to camps, and some are hiding in the gurdwaras. Do you expect more violence? Who knows? He laughed. It depends on what the people at the top want. The day before Mrs. Gandhi's funeral, the violence stopped as suddenly as it had begun. Army trucks appeared in areas where the massacres had taken place, and in minutes the mobs vanished. The killers went back to being tailors and carpenters, butchers and political workers. Nobody was punished. No questions asked. Most Indians believed that the Sikhs deserved to be punished, as became evident from the massive mandate they gave Rajiv in the election that was to follow. Rajiv Gandhi reflected this mood when some weeks after his mother's funeral, he justified the violence. When a big tree falls, the earth shakes, he said. It took Atal Bihari Vajpayee to refute this extraordinary insensitive comment by responding that Rajiv was a child and did not understand that it is when the earth shakes that trees fall. But Vajpayee, as the election was to soon prove, was not as much in tune with the times as Rajiv was. And Rajiv was correct in describing his mother as a big tree. She was more than that. Whatever her flaws, she continues to be remembered by ordinary Indians as one of the country's greatest prime ministers. What appealed to the middle-class Indians was her strength, and what appealed to illiterate rural voters was her concern for their needs. She may not have succeeded in lifting them out of poverty, but she more than succeeded in convincing India's poorest citizens that she was their leader, their only leader. Short of ordering the sun to rise, Rajiv Gandhi could have done almost anything when he began his career as Prime Minister. It is hard to think of another leader who could have started with more goodwill, love and hope. There was so much that needed to be done, so much he could have done. He could have changed the economic policies that had kept India poor. He could have got rid of the corrupt courtiers who surrounded his mother and created within India's oldest and most important political party a culture of sycophancy and servility. He could have made up for the biggest failures of his mother and grandfather by investing in the areas they had neglected and for which India was already beginning to pay a heavy price. Education, healthcare, planned urbanization and modern services in rural India. Why he did not take even a tentative step towards a new direction remains a mystery. For me, there was personal disappointment, almost from the start. He did nothing to stop the massacre of the Sikhs in those first terrible days of his rule, and then went out of his way to justify the barbarism we saw unleashed on the streets of Delhi. I found myself wondering whether the goodness I had always seen as his finest quality had been a deception. The Rajiv I thought I knew would have stopped the bloodshed and would have risked his own life to do so. He would at least have been capable of the ordinary compassion that made my other Hindu friends form vigilante squads in Delhi's more genteel residential areas to defend Sikh families against the mobs. But Rajiv and his close aides showed neither concern nor horror at what happened. When I personally approached a very important member of Rajiv's inner circle on the second day of the violence, I was dismissed as if I were wasting his time. I ran into this gentleman on the grounds of Teen Murti House, where Mrs. Gandhi's body had been laid in state for the period of public mourning. When I stopped him and tried to tell him how terrible the violence was in the city, he said, We know. We are doing something about it." Then he went back to talking on his walkie-talkie, dismissing me with a wave as if he had more important things to do than worry about massacres on the streets of Delhi. The killings continued until the arrival of important foreign leaders for the funeral of Mrs. Gandhi made it necessary for the violence to end. Another reason why I read you this excerpt from this book is because there is a certain narrative being peddled by the Khalistanis that the 1984 violence against the Sikhs was some sort of a planned event by the Hindus, but that is not true at all. This violence was only perpetrated by the Congress party political leaders and their workers, The Hindus, in fact, were involved in saving their Sikh friends and Sikh neighbors, as the writer also mentioned in the book. You can ask anybody who was alive at that time, ask anybody, and they'll tell you that the Sikhs were saved by the Hindus. The Congress leaders and the other people who were responsible for this horrid act against the Sikhs were all rewarded by the Congress party, from Sajjan Kumar to Jagdish Titler and Kamal Nath. Sajjan Kumar, who was accused of inciting and leading mobs, was given a Congress ticket, which he won in the 91 elections. He again won in 2004 from Outer Delhi. And despite allegations, he served on parliamentary committees until convicted in 2018. And then, of course, he was sentenced to life imprisonment for murder. Jagdish Titler, who was accused by witnesses of rebuking others for not carrying out the killings as promised, remained a mainstay in the Congress Delhi unit. He was repeatedly given tickets by Congress, winning in 2004 and made a union minister. Kamal Nath, accused of giving directions to mobs near a Gurdwara, was rewarded by being made Chief Minister of Madhya Pradesh by Congress. He is considered very close to the current Gandhi family. H.K.L. Bhagat, named for instigating violence, served as Congress MP and Union Minister for 22 years, despite allegations in the Nanavati Commission report. Alit Makan allegedly paid mobs and provided Sikh house lists, but faced no action. Dharamdas Shastri, a Congress MP, allegedly gave lists of Sikh houses and pressured police against arrests. Instead of punishing them, the Congress party repeatedly rewarded these tainted leaders with tickets and ministries and positions of power over the years. Sajjan Kumar was convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment for his role in the riots, but others like Titler and Nath were never prosecuted due to lack of evidence. And with this, we come to the end of this episode of the Indologia podcast. If you liked it, then please give me a 5-star rating on Apple and Spotify or whichever podcast or music platform you are listening to this on. You should also follow me on the social media. The name is the same everywhere. It's Indologia, Indologia. Until the next time I see you, Jai Hind, Vande Mataram.